Good morning, class. Welcome to the next week of MS501. Again, probably starting to sound like a broken record, but I appreciate the quality of conversation that's going on in the discussion center. You folks are doing a really fine job raising some really important questions, so keep up the good work. Continue to move forward with your ethnographer's work. If I were you, I mean, you can do whatever you want to in this project at some level, so don't take what I'm about to say as a hard and fast rule. But I would probably match the work that you're doing on the ethnographic notes with the work that you want to do on the congregational study project a little bit later. That'll let you do a little bit more research, a little bit more in-depth, and it'll make your two projects sort of dovetail together. Now, I would encourage you, I think I've said this to those of you who've asked, to get outside of yourself to the extent that you can to really give yourself a chance to take this assignment as deeply as you can. Some of you may be in situations where you simply can't do that. If you can't, you can't. I'm not sure what I can say beyond that. But the chance to get to use this as an opportunity to get outside of your own congregation, perhaps outside of your own tradition, perhaps even outside your own religion, the more different it is from you, the more you can develop these skills that we've been talking about, the skills of being able to enter in and observe, the ability to suspend our own personal judgments. If we go into a setting that we're too familiar with, then our own presuppositions, the things we already know about this particular congregation or setting, will undoubtedly have an impact on what we're doing, and it won't let us get the most from the work that we might otherwise get. But again, I understand that there are constraints that some of you have to deal with, and we'll take those and deal with them as we go along. This week, by the way, I want to keep this lecture relatively short, and I'm only going to post maybe 3 questions or 4 at the most in the discussion center, because what I want to do is leave this week as an opportunity for you to collaborate with each other. I want you to have the opportunity to ask each other questions about the projects you're working on. If you find something particularly interesting or something particularly disturbing or something surprising and you want to air that in front of the rest of your colleagues, then I would encourage you to do that. This is not a class where I want you to feel like you have to hunker down and not look over each other's shoulder. Learn from each other. Engage in collaboration to the extent you can. And I want to use this as a week to allow that. I'm still going to read like I always do. I'll jump in and discuss as well. But feel free to ask each other for input. Here's what I discovered in my observations. What do y'all think about that? Take advantage of that. Today I want to spend most of my time in the video lecture here talking about the book or the essay by Hebert in Landmark Essays in Mission and World Christianity. There are a number of important points that he raises in here, and I want to make sure that we spend the time getting our arms around them. This essay at one level is fundamentally about the whole question of epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, and frequently the study of knowledge is undertaken from the perspective of trying to better understand how it is we come to know the things that we know. Now the goal, as Alvin Plantinga has said in some of his writings, the goal of epistemology is to come to knowledge. We want to come to true beliefs about things. At least that should be the goal of epistemology. I know that all of us get influenced by our own presuppositions, by our own ideological commitments, and sometimes what we really want to find is something that reinforces in stuff that we already believe rather than discovering the truth. If we be honest about it, I think that's sometimes what happens. But the goal of epistemology should be to find the truth, to find beliefs that we can hold, that we have confidence that are true. Now, one of the definitions for a true belief is that it's warranted, true, and that we believe it. Now, I mean, those things are relatively straightforward. To rightly hold some particular belief, it has to be warranted for us. That is, we have to have a basis for believing it. The different theories in epistemology often take their names for how they understand this notion of what it means to hold a particular belief in a warranted or justified or rational way. Those words mean slightly different things, but here I'm just going to use them interchangeably for sort of shorthand purposes. And then second, true, you can't really know something that's false. You might think you know it, but according to this definition, if you believe some proposition P to be true and it turns out to be false, then you can't say that you knew P. And then finally, of course, you have to believe it. It would be really strange to say, I believe some proposition P to be true, but I think it's false. Or I'm sorry, I believe it, but I believe it's false. Right? I mean, to say you believe something is to believe that it's true. And now what Hebert is doing then is digging into epistemology at a particular angle. And what I would say is that at the highest level, the categories that he's looking through, I'm going to come at them in two different ways to try to help add a little, or flesh out or supplement what he's saying there. One way to think about it is in terms of realism. Three positions that are commonly held with regard to epistemology are a realist position, an anti-realist position, and a critical realist position. The realist position simply says that things are what they seem to be. Right? Now let me give you an example. You might say, well, doesn't everybody believe that to be the case? Well, not necessarily. There's an essay in a collection of introductory essays to philosophy that I used to use for a class I taught on philosophy. And the title of the essay is something like The Story of the Two Tables, or something like that. But what the author is trying to get at in this particular essay is to draw the distinction between what our senses tell us about a table and what turns out to be true about a table. So for example, here's what he's getting at. If you look at a table, so there's a table sitting here before you, you tap it with your fingers, you slide your hands across the surface, you maybe pick it up to see how heavy it is, and what that says to you is that that's a solid object, that there's real stuff there, and that's a solid solid piece of wood or metal or whatever kind of table it is. What science tells us, however, is that if you could expand this table, if you could get a super microscope that would let you see the smallest details of this particular table, what science tells us is that if we get in there far enough, we're going to find molecules, ultimately atoms, and at an even lower level than that, subatomic particles, electrons, protons, neutrons, and even beyond that if we could continue our magnification. What science tells us is that an atom is composed of far more space than it is material. If you could take this table and collapse all of the subatomic particles literally on top of each other to where they were touching, what you'd end up with is a much, much, much smaller object than what you see as the table before you. So what the realist would say, in a very simplistic sort of way, is that this table just is what it seems to be, a solid object. Okay, now an anti-realist says that things are really very different than we see them. They believe that our perceptions of the world and what the world are like are different, or minimally that we don't know how different they are, because all we can ever really know are our perceptions. So a realist is sort of the flip side, anti-realist by its name of course, is sort of the flip side of the realist position. Idealism might be an anti-realist position at some level, because what it believes is that ideas are more real than the concrete objects that we think we experience in the world. The third position, though, is a critical realist. This is somewhere in between the two. It recognizes that the realist position is a little too naive. Things are more complicated than that. But it won't accept the anti-realist position that things just aren't what they seem to be at all. And so what you end up with is a moderating position that says things are mostly like they seem to be, but a good deal more complicated than they might seem to be. I think that's what we're getting at here in this essay by Hebert. I think where he ends up is being a critical realist in his attempt to try to say that things are mostly like they seem to be, but there's a level of complexity that's easy to overlook if we tend to stay firmly rooted in the realist camp. Another way to think about this is the three categories. I think Ted Peters uses these in his systematic theology. He talks about pre-critical naivete, critical deconstruction, and then post-critical reconstruction. These things are not the same as the three categories I mentioned to you before. It's coming at this question from a different angle, but I think you can see the similarities. pre-critical naivete is like the way we are before we thought about things critically, right? It's sort of just taking things as we see them. It's the simplistic understanding of things. You know, if as a kid you're growing up and you see the world, you just sort of take it as you see it. And the first time you find out that things aren't the way they seem to be, the first time you find out that somebody is really not the person they pretend to be, you're really disappointed, because what you find out is that the world isn't quite like you thought, not quite as simple as you thought. And so then you engage, often we do this in our teens, we engage in a period of critical deconstruction. We've been fooled by our pre-critical naivete. We're not going to go back there. We're not going to be fooled again. And so we engage in deconstructing everything around us, trying to understand it at some deeper level. And what happens is we basically deconstruct the world. Our criticism, our critical analysis isn't satisfied until we've sort of taken the world apart. But then what we find is you can't really live there either. I mean, to live permanently in the place of critical deconstruction is to sort of live in a world torn apart but not put back together. Post-critical reconstruction, though, is when we begin to try to put our world back together. We recognize that there was some truth to our naivete. The world isn't always very different than it seems to be. Sometimes it is pretty much what it seems to be. But we're not in this critical mode where we're trying to tear everything down either and just sort of end up in some broad nihilism or something like that. Instead, we're trying to put the world back together in a critical way, not being naive, not being overly critical, but arriving at a place where we can be comfortable that we have a reasonable grasp, probably never a complete grasp, but a reasonable grasp on the nature of the world around us. I believe at some level what Hebert is about in this particular article is recognizing that there was a simplicity to how he saw the world, that there was an element of complexity that he had been missing. And so through the recognition of this shortfall, this place where he wasn't quite seeing things as he should, it's by recognition of that then that he can begin a post-critical reconstruction of the world in a fuller way. Let's take a look at pages 179. Notice that he begins by citing this example. It's in both Matthew and in Luke, citing this example of the John's in jail, and he sends his disciples to ask if this is really, Jesus is really the one. I think, imagine you're in John's position. You've invested your whole life in the proclamation of this guy, Jesus of Nazareth, is the Messiah. You've risked everything on that being correct. But now you've been arrested. You've been arrested because of that very challenging message that you've been preaching in light of the belief that Jesus is the Christ. So now you're in jail. Jails then were even worse than they are today. And so you look around you and you think, I've invested my whole life in a set of activities that's resulted in my being here. That's okay if I'm right, but what if I'm wrong? What if this wasn't the Messiah? So he rounds up some of his disciples and he says, go off, find Jesus, and ask him, are you the one or not? Now, Jesus could have said, yep, I'm the one. Flashed out his member of the Trinity ID card, shown it to him, and sent them on their way back to John, who was in jail. But that's not what he does. He doesn't give him an argument. I mean, here's how Hebert says it. Jesus answered, not with logical proofs, but by a demonstration of power in the curing of the sick and casting out evil spirits. This is consistent with the thread that we've been discussing and what we saw in Jenkins' work as well, right? That what we see in the third world is not nearly so much the arguments, rational arguments for people to become Christians, but the role that the supernatural plays in that. He goes on a little bit further. As a Westerner, I was used to presenting Christ on the basis of rational arguments, not by the evidence of his power in the lives of people who were sick, possessed, and destitute. And now the thing that makes me wonder is the extent to which we engage in our preaching and teaching and our interactions with those around us on an everyday basis in a way that basically presupposes the very world that Hebrews mentioned. How often do our sermons get built on a foundation that is precisely this foundation, the rational argument, the reasonable Jesus, and how often do we engage in the more supernatural, the more displays of power? How often do we ask people in our congregation to share testimonies about what Christ has done in their particular lives? Right? We take that as being so subjective that sometimes we just shy away from it. Okay, let us move on now to page 180 and 181. It's interesting that he talks about the three ways that in the cultures that he has in mind here in his work, the three ways in which people deal with illnesses. Right? There's three of them. The first one is what he calls by traditional methods. We do that here in the West as well. The old feed a cold, starve a fever, however that particular saying goes. I don't know if I have that right or backwards. But we have these sort of common sense, traditional things that we do to deal with illnesses. And so the first thing we often do when an illness presents itself is we take one of those steps. The second thing that he mentions, I'm actually going to skip to the third one he mentions, but I'm going to name it as second. The second thing is scientific knowledge. Alright, so our traditional remedies don't work. We do the commonsensical things that we've been taught in our families to do for the kinds of illnesses that arise, and the person's not getting better. So what do? Well, the next thing we do is we appeal to scientific knowledge. We take ourselves, our child, our parents, whatever, we take them to the doctor, and here's an expert in the scientific knowledge of the body, and we ask them to assess what's going on with this person and to prescribe a treatment. So, traditional first, scientific second. Then the third one, he actually puts it in the middle, as I said, but the third thing that he mentions in these more primitive cultures is that they appeal to magician. They go to the witch doctor, to someone who can do incantations or can take other steps, who's supposed to be able to bring healing about through these means. Now, when he talks about the flaw of the excluded middle in this chapter, this way, not the traditional, not the scientific, but this middle way of magic is the thing that he says I really hadn't figured, I hadn't really taken seriously, I hadn't really looked into. Flipping on over then to page 184. There are three pairs that he lists here to help us in analyzing religious systems that we might engage with. Now let's take a look at each of these pairs. The first one is the organic analogy versus the mechanical analogy. How do we understand the world in which we live? Is it a living thing? Or is it a machine, more analogous to a machine? If you look at the philosophy of Spinoza, for example, his view of the universe was very mechanistic. Everything happened as a consequence of things that happened in the past, causal relationships that led us to where we are. A scientific determinist would say that we are where we are in the world today, and it could have been no different given the way that the past has unfolded. There is no such thing as free will. The living entities that we experience are really just different kinds of machines, different kinds of mechanisms, but it's all causally determined. On the other end of the spectrum is the organic view, the view that things are living, that humans have free will, that animals to an extent have free will, that we make choices, and that the way that the world unfolds is not analogous to a machine, but more like a relational view, a view that involves morality, because morality is about choices. In a mechanistic view, there isn't morality because there aren't choices. Things just happen the way they do for causal reasons. And if things happen on a purely deterministic basis, to describe them as moral or immoral really has no bite to it. You might name them that way just for the sake of convenient categorization, but you can't make moral judgments in the sense of holding somebody accountable or not in a world in which things are determined, because they have no control for it to have been any different. Then the other pair, another pair that he uses is the unseen or supernatural over against the seen or the empirical. Now again, in the West, you know, the happy recipients of this tradition of the sciences, we tend to be on the seen or the empirical side. We judge things based on what we can see or sense in some way. I mean, seen is just taken here metaphorically for access to it by any one of our senses. It's empirical in the sense that we can see it, we can manipulate it, we can write down test results, we can write, you know, we can do other tests and expect those results to come out the same. We learn through empiricism. The other end of the spectrum, or the other side of the coin, if you will, is the supernatural. The world that we don't see. The things that happen in the world that are attributable to forces that we don't see and we don't understand. And then the third pair is otherworldly versus this worldly. Otherworldly, well, let's do them in the same order I've been doing. This worldly are, you know, back to the things that we see as part of this physical world that we're a part of. We can see it, we can understand it, and it makes sense to us. The otherworldly is to admit that there is something beyond the physical that we don't fully understand, but that has an impact on what happens to us in our day-to-day lives. He goes over these in some detail, so I would encourage you to look them over, raise any questions that you have with regard to that. But you can see that what this does is gives us different ways to think about religions along these two spectrums, right? Or, I'm sorry, three spectrums. Organic versus mechanistic, seen versus unseen, this worldly versus otherworldly. On page 186, he actually shows this diagram at the top, 186, and sort of graphically represents what this particular essay is about. And that is this whole notion of the excluded middle. So what he says is, I'd grown up in the West, and I'd become a good product of Western philosophy and the Western sciences and so on. And so I understand religion in a particular way. I understand the sciences in a particular way. But there's some sort of intersection between religion and science, this thing in the middle that I don't really have a good accounting for. And here's how he says it on 186. The reasons for my uneasiness with the biblical and Indian worldviews should be clear. Now what he means by the biblical and the Indian is a worldview in which supernatural things happen in this world, where religion isn't just about a phenomenological description of the kinds of interrelationships that we develop around religions, but rather religion is a recognition that there is something beyond what we can see, taste, and feel, and that those powers and principalities, if you will, have an impact on us in the real world. So what he says is, the reasons for my uneasiness with the biblical and Indian worldview should be clear. I had excluded the middle level of supernatural, this worldly beings and forces from my own worldview. See, he recognized supernatural, otherworldly, right? Because that's often how we think of God. But those powers that interact with us in this world, those were the things that he had not accounted for. And what he goes on to say a little bit later is, for me, the middle zone did not really exist. Unlike Indian villagers, I had given little thoughts to spirits of this world, to local ancestors and ghosts, or to the souls of animals. He goes on then to talk about his attribution of this shortcoming in his knowledge, and attributes it, I mean, the attribution of it to Platonic dualism, which is this dualism between mind and body. I'm not going to get into detail about that. I mean, I do some philosophy courses, as you might guess, from time to time as well. And I have a whole presentation on the mind-body dualism and the Platonic sense of that. I'd be happy to go into that in more detail, but I think that pretty much what we need is what's covered here in what Hebert talks about. Now what's interesting is that Alvin Plantinga, in some of his work, talks about this phenomenon that Hebert talks about. You know, he's saying, I had not taken into account this, what he calls the excluded middle level of reality. Well, what Plantinga charges Christians with in the world today is that we function as methodological naturalists. Now, this goes even a step further than what Hebert's talking about, but it makes a similar point. We, as Christians, allow ourselves to be dictated to by the sciences in a way that causes us to do the kind of things that Hebert's talking about. That is, we dismiss the miraculous, we dismiss the supernatural, and we do our work as theologians as if naturalism was true, when in reality, that's probably not what we really believe. So we end up with a dichotomy between what we say we believe and how we actually live that out. On page 188 and following, he begins to get into the implications of this for mission. So what's it mean? It's an interesting set of observations that he makes. So why does this have an impact on how we think about missions? Well, at the end of the third paragraph after the page break, after the section break, implications for missions, down 3 paragraphs, last sentence. Let me just do the whole paragraph. On the middle level, a holistic theology includes a theology of God in human history, in the affairs of nations, of peoples, and of individuals. This must include a theology of divine guidance, provision and healing, of ancestors, spirits, and invisible powers of this world, and of suffering, misfortune, and death. That's one of the quotes that I think I'm going to post as part of the discussion questions that I post tomorrow. I want to really flesh this out and think about what that means. I don't want to hear your disagreements. I suspect there's some of you who may say, I'm not entirely sure I want to go where Hebert's talking about. I want to hear your concerns about that as well. A second implication he lists on down there toward the bottom. A second implication is that the church and mission must guard against Christianity itself becoming a new form of magic. Now that's an interesting charge, isn't it? There's a quote from Houston Smith. He writes a lot about comparative religions. He actually may be dead now, but this is a relatively old book that I'm thinking of. But he's talking about magic incantations and prayer. And here's what he says. It's not an exact quote, but it's in the ballpark. He says, the difference between magic and prayer is the following. In magic, we attempt to manipulate the divine powers to our will. We try to bend God to do what we want. In prayer, we try to align ourselves with God's will. Thy will be done on earth as in heaven. So the goal in prayer is a change in us to conform to God's will, whereas in magic, it focuses on getting the world to come out the way we want it, and to do that by manipulating the divine powers. Now, Smith could have stopped there, but what he did go on and say was much of what passes for prayer in Christian circles under these definitions would better be called magic. And I think that's some of what he has in mind here as well. If we're not careful, we can become just another form of magic. And then finally, on page 189, it's interesting. He prayed for this. He starts off talking about a person who asked him to pray for an ill child. He prays, the child doesn't recover, and so now he's worried. How are they going to view me? I couldn't even pray in a way that brought healing. What are they going to think about my God? But what happens is that in Christianity, we recognize that healing for all of us doesn't always come. In fact, for all of us, there is a point in our lives where healing doesn't come and we die. But we carry with us in the Christian faith a hope of the resurrection. And here's what he said. The village would have acknowledged the power of our God had he healed the child. But they knew in the end she would have to die. Right? At some point, we're all going to die. When they saw in the funeral our hope of resurrection and reunion in heaven, they saw an even greater victory over death itself, and they have begun to ask about the Christian way. Interesting observation. So again, there are lots of good stuff to poke around in here, so I'll post some questions tomorrow. Let me say again, though, like I did last week, think of the discussion center as a place to hold up your hand as well. If there's something you want to ask, and you don't have to send me an email on the side. Just post it there in the discussion center, and we'll discuss it together. Let me just quickly hit a couple of points from the essays and field projects, so projects 4 and 5 that we were looking at this week. First of all, he talks about the role of the informant in Project 4. If we're going to engage in ethnographic notes and we're going to treat someone in that, and then build that into our congregational project, if we're going to treat someone in that group like an informant, it's very important that we be mindful of the sorts of things that are mentioned here. How do you select who the informant's going to be? What sort of relationship do you develop with the informant to make sure that they continue to give you the information that you need? And then how do you make sure that in the course of relationship development you don't communicate with them in a way that lets them know, cues them into what you want the answer to be, and then biases them in a way that they'll give you what they want to hear. We all like approval, and for the most part, if we serve as an informant with someone who lets us know what they want, we will often help them to find the things they want to find, which isn't what we should be about. What we want to find, what we want to engage in, is the best observation that we possibly can, and not come into a particular setting trying to prove that our preconceived notions are true. On page 65, moving on to the next one, I thought it was very interesting, and maybe this is helpful for some of our critique of Wesley in those earlier sermons. At one point, after spending some time living in the lodges of his Indian friends, Schoolcraft discovered that the Indians created myths, tales, and legends that they told both for amusement and instruction. Today we take it for granted that even the most technologically primitive people can possess an artistic tradition, be it graphic or verbal, of great richness and complexity. But notice what's next. But it was a revelation of the first order in Schoolcraft's day. In other words, the way in which people tended to see primitive cultures was critically. And so what you see in Wesley is that he was basically a product of his day in the way that he talked about barbarians and so on in his writings and in that essay that we looked at earlier. It's this whole notion of Western ascendancy that we see on page 68. Even some of the greatest social thinkers of the 19th century were explicitly ethnocentric. Freud, for example, felt that Western civilization, for all its imperfections, was the pinnacle of human achievement. So how do we genuinely observe those around us if we go in with a set of presuppositions that require us to see ourselves as ethnocentrically superior, and then of course entering necessarily, as a consequence of that, into a critical relationship with those we engage. If a culture were truly inadequate, he goes on to note, it would not enable its people to survive, and it would disappear. What's the central goal of any particular cultural set of structures is to allow the people to survive. And as he says, if they were culturally inferior, genuinely inadequate, they wouldn't have survived. So survival alone is evidence of some kind of adequacy. On page 67, what you'll notice, and then on page 68 he talks about culture shock. On 67, I'm not going to get into the details, but the question I have for you, the thing you have to think about as you're engaged in your research, is how do we observe things that we judge to be immoral? Right? I mean, the example that he gives here is one in which certain kinds of behaviors seem to us to be immoral. How are we going to suspend our judgment long enough to allow us to observe things in a way that let us genuinely understand the culture, rather than seeing the culture through our lens, our own lens, the lens of our own culture, imposing our judgments on it, and drawing conclusions based on that. Culture shock is a very real thing. And then on page 71, just note what he says, 2/3 of the way or so down. But try at this stage to keep your observations as pure as possible. In other words, the worst thing you could do before you go out and engage in your congregational research is to say, oh, okay, I'm going to go study some Mormons. Well, let me look up Mormonism on Wikipedia, or let me get a couple of books on Mormonism. Because what's going to happen is you're going to be prejudiced by the views of the authors of those particular articles and books. And so when you go in and observe, you're going to think that you know things already, and it's going to blind you to things that wouldn't align with what your presuppositions are. So by keeping it pure, I think what he means is we need to just go and observe, bringing with us as few presuppositions as possible. And of course this is why I suggested trying to get out of your own particular cultural setting would give you the best opportunity to do that, because otherwise you will inevitably bring with you a set of presuppositions about what you understand about your own tradition, your own church, or so on. Alright, that's pretty much what I wanted to cover with you today as far as the lecture is concerned. You know the ritual. Tomorrow I'll post questions, and then I'll look forward to discussing with you those questions and any that you might raise. Have a great day, and we'll see you again next week.